Columbia, this is Houston, ALS, over.
Houston, Columbia, Navigate, over.
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully.
Whoops, let me straighten that out. A lot of people don't recognise the guy I'm talking to there, but that's Neil Armstrong. I consider myself to be incredibly lucky, having worked indirectly for NASA for over 30 years. That one there is another astronaut, that's Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon, talking to myself and my wife Betty and Mike Dinn in the background there. It was a worldwide joyous event, and it suddenly dawned on us that maybe we had helped improve people's outlook at that time.
The Apollo 11 mission in particular, and the Apollo 11 television, as it's turned out, really was the highlight of my career. I didn't sort of realise it at the time, and the highlight, ironically, is somewhat in a negative form. Nothing went wrong. Everything we'd trained for, everything we'd practiced, everything we'd talked about, everything we'd documented, all worked. So I was both enthused about the whole event, and I was in some ways more importantly, I was confident we could cope with anything unusual because we'd given a great deal of thought to it.
I thought, how lucky I am to be in the Australian bush with kangaroos feeding around me and being involved with mankind's greatest adventure. It gave me big goosebumps. It was a very special time.
Better go back to the beginning. I was recruited from UK after I had travelled to Australia on a couple of business trips before, and was luckily offered jobs at both Tidbinbilla and Honeysuckle. The director of Tidbinbilla was sponsoring my migration, but I felt I had to tell him that I thought Honeysuckle and manned spaceflight was somewhat more exciting than deep space in those days. I ended up working at Honeysuckle from 1966 through to 1981. The manned spaceflight was hugely exciting. Loved all the whole bit, and went through all the Apollo missions and all the Skylab missions before we eventually changed to deep space missions.
My job was to look after the antenna pointing, the antenna data, the time standard and the ranging system. When we started, there was no equipment, it was all just the antenna and an empty sort of building, and it was a terrible job getting up to work. We used to have a rough track which got us up to work. Often in the winter we used to leave the cars at the bottom of the hill and go up in four-wheel drives and cars with chains on the wheels. We used to put rocks in the boot and put the weight of the car down so it had a better grip of the road. These huge boulders, bigger than cars, used to roll down the hill and land on the road. Luckily, there was never a car underneath it, although I had an experience where I was photographing one rock and I heard a sort of clicking noise above me, and I looked up and I didn't see anything, so I finished taking the picture, went back to the station, and the admin officer came and said, "Hey, did you see the two rocks on the road?" And I said, "What two rocks?" So when I went down to check, there was a rock standing in the ditch right where I was been taking the picture of the first rock. That could have fallen on top of me.
In about mid-67, I was asked if I would move to the Honeysuckle Creek station, which was built dedicated uniquely for the Apollo missions. And so in about September '67, I moved from Tidbinbilla to Honeysuckle, doing similar things, but of course never been involved with manned flight. I'm not sure what about all the people who were already there thought of me coming in out of the blue. They'd all had specialist training overseas. I never did for the Apollo thing, but it wasn't too difficult to pick up what was involved.
We had some 18 months or so of training at Honeysuckle before the first manned mission, which was Apollo 7. That was an Earth orbit mission, and we weren't really organised for Earth orbit stuff. We were primarily a lunar distance or lunar activities station.
We had a team on the ground from Goddard who would evaluate our progress, how we performed. They'd toss in a whole lot of problems, procedural problems, equipment problems. And of course, if we didn't come up to the standard, we were grilled. I remember there was one moment where they came up to me and said, that PC board there has failed. Go and get another one. So out came the stopwatch, and I had to rush off to the store and get another spare. And they timed how long it took me to get that spare. That's how thorough they were.
Our first major mission was Apollo 7. This was the first manned Apollo mission, and we became one of the dozen or so stations around the world. And towards the end of Apollo 7, I remember someone, I can't remember whom exactly, probably Tom Reed, the director, saying, could we support a mission to the moon before Christmas? That's the way it transpired. So when the moon mission was formalized, we moved from being in the second division of the tracking stations to the first division. The three of us who had the big dishes were the ones who were designed, built, put in place specifically for the missions to the moon. And so came Apollo 8 in December, which in some ways was the gutsiest mission of them all, putting 3 people in a spacecraft and shooting them off towards the moon, hopefully.
Nobody had ever been further than 850 miles away from the surface of the Earth, and here they were going off around the moon 250,000 miles away. In the Apollo period, we were basically working 12-hour shifts up at Honeysuckle with an hour's travelling either side of that, so we didn't have a huge amount of time at home. My poor old family suffered a lot when I used to come home, and they'd have to be quiet and all the rest of it. And at the end of Skylab and beyond, I suddenly realised I hadn't seen my kids grow up at all. It was a bit sad. Men tend to do that, they tend to get wrapped up in their jobs. And I'm sorry about that, but that's the way it was.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
This is a picture of the Prime Minister on the day. You notice in the picture everybody is smoking, except for us two on the console at the moment. Well, I'll tell you what caused me the most grief was a visit of a Prime Minister screwing up our countdown, and so it diverted the station a fair bit when we were meant to be getting organised. However, he was a real Prime Minister and he was at a real tracking station.
Suddenly I had to drop everything and rush off to the darkroom, load some film into my camera and follow him around taking pictures of the tour around the station. After he left, was back to the mission again.
When they decided to get out early, that wasn't any particular big deal from our point of view at Honeysuckle. There was nothing new or different going to happen. It was just going to happen a bit earlier than we'd thought it might. Where it did have an effect was in regard to Parkes, the radio telescope at Parkes. It had been expected to be the prime recipient of the television, but because it got out early, the moon hadn't risen into the view of the Parkes dish. So we were at Honeysuckle were receiving the television picture. Television from Honeysuckle went to Houston, and Houston decided to select the Honeysuckle picture over the California one, and that's the one that went to the world of the actual physical first step.
I'm going to step off the limb. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from radio. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Obviously, the first problem was that the timeline changed fairly dramatically after they landed. I mean, how on earth would you expect two astronauts who just landed on the moon to go and have a nap before they got out of the spacecraft? That was all in the timeline, but of course Armstrong and Aldrin said, look, we're not going to nap at all, we want to get out, get on with it. At the time we lived at the Hotel Canberra. The Hotel Canberra was the headquarters, I suppose, of the Liberal Party members. When they came to Canberra, most of them lived in the hotel while Parliament was in session. So it was quite an exciting time to be in Canberra in those few years when the moon landing took place.
There was such a build-up to it, and of course we were glued to the TV when they were going to land on the moon. And, you know, there was the anticipation and excitement of what was going to happen, and it was such a big event in our life at the time.
No, they're pretty good, and there's that one we took with Nixon in
the funny thing was we talked about at the time, Arthur always thought he was going to go to the moon in 20 years' time. And I mean, still they're not there today. But, you know, that's what it instilled in people too, I think.
President Nixon probably talking to the people on the moon at the time.
But I guess it all harks back to that photo. It's kind of, I guess I never thought it would be so historic. And 50 years later to think, oh wow, I was there. I don't remember it, but I was there.
We decided, well, this is an historic moment. I think we thought those sorts of things and actually deliberately put it in front of the TV at the time they had the landing, because it was significant.
It's got the man walking on the moon. I think that's really good.
Maybe I could still be the first woman to walk on the moon.
My name's Judith Perkins. I've lived in Canberra since 1949 when my dad arrived and who was doing his apprenticeship as a plumber within the Canberra region. I went to art college and then on to CSIRO, Division of Wildlife Research, where I was working in July 1969. On the day of the 20th of July, our workplace had hired a black and white TV, which was set up in our old tea room. We'd sort of drop in there and watch these fuzzy black and white figures on the screen. For a 20-year-old, it was an interesting experience because at the time it didn't seem quite real, but the thing that really got me was that we were watching this happening in real time. And we'd sit there sipping our cups of tea and then come back again, and it was a really amazing time. I believe that heritage is our past, and I think we need to look to our past to establish the future. I really believe that areas like Honeysuckle Creek need to be retained. And I just thought it's part of our landscape, and I really think it's a very important element of the part that we played in the first man on the moon.
Normally there were 3 or 4 of us in each car going home after the end of a day's support on something like Apollo, and there'd be a lot of chatter in the cars about what happened, what went well, what didn't go so well, and so on and so on. But after Apollo 11, on that day, they were very quiet, most of the cars. I know my car was. I know the car that a friend of mine was in was just dead silence all the way home, which was pretty weird. I think everybody was just thinking, oh, blimey, maybe they really were up on the moon doing something. It gradually filtered down that it was a worldwide joyous event, considering all the other horrible things that were happening. And it suddenly dawned on us that maybe we had helped improve people's outlook at that time.
Well, this camera, which I used through the Apollo missions, and while I was at Honeysuckle, is this Linhof Super Technica 4x5. I've always been a great believer in photographs, and I thought it was very important to have pictures of things. Family, for instance, it's all history. As they grow up, you lose track of what they look like and what they were like, unless you've got a photograph to prove it. Honeysuckle, I always felt was an important station, and I always felt that it ought to be preserved. I wasn't thinking so much what was going to happen afterwards, but just as long as it was taken, it was there for people to see in the future. Once the station's gone, all you've got are the photographs. The ones that have died, the only picture you've got is the picture of them at work. Without that photograph, you wouldn't have it.
The second time we came off the side of Mount Taylor, dirt road, sheep on the road, driver avoiding action, got into a slide down over the edge, ended up about, 30 or 40 metres down the hill on top of a rock.
When he came home after an accident, he didn't tell me straight away, so we'd talk to the children, we'd have our dinner, and then probably when we were sitting up in bed he'd say, oh, by the way, we had this sort of accident today, and he would sort of try to explain what had happened. And I thought, oh, yeah, he looks all right, so I didn't worry.
It's quite remarkable when you think about it that 50 years ago the mountains of the Bush capital played such a pivotal role in capturing a remarkable image and words, and then relaying that to the world, and the world sat there holding its breath as a man took a step on a distant planet. And some 50 years later, to be celebrating that is really quite remarkable for us as a national park. The history lesson of today is to think about what tomorrow will judge. How will tomorrow judge what we do today? And that's probably one of the key principles that we as a community need to take from celebrating such remarkable events. Those that will walk in our footsteps will celebrate what we do today. And that's something I think we should be very, very mindful of. Not that far from where we sit here today, there is indications, there are artefacts, there is paintings that talk of people in this landscape, that talks of people traversing through this landscape, using the night sky as a navigation beacon. We are very conscious of making sure that to celebrate the 50th anniversary, we also pay homage and appreciate that the footsteps that we walk in are those that have been trotted by people dating back tens of thousands of years. The elements that we're putting together here at Honeysuckle really speak of celebrating both the Ngunnawal history and our European NASA history. There's a wonderful line from Ngunnawal to NASA, one valley, one story, but many, many different tales, and that is what we have here within the Madgee National Park.
The Mint here has produced a special dollar coin and 5-cent coin, and part of a full set of coins. We weren't really aware that this was in work, but the result is quite good.
This particular photograph was, I understand, used to inspire the design, if you like, of the $1 special coin as part of the 6-coin set, and we were pretty happy with that, except they'd given me a moustache on the 6-coin set. I think they looked at the microphone and thought that was a moustache. I don't know.
But at one stage, Frederick Houston says, we're having a chat in the middle of the night or something, says, I don't understand all those Australian accents. And we looked around, there's me from England, there's John from England, there's Tom Reed from Scotland, there's Ian Grant from Scotland, and there's an Italian fella. And I thought, they never hear an Australian accent at Houston. Not a genuine Australian accent.
I was lucky with these two pictures. They were having a clear out of the director's office, and they weren't exactly going to check them out, but I thought I'd try and get hold of them, and I gave the people a couple of scones and jam and cream off the trolley, and got those in return. So I was pretty happy with that. But they have faded quite a lot. It is quite nostalgic. That's the rock where the wombat used to live under there, and nobody'd go near him because he was covered in fleas and flies. And you know, this is where the kangaroo used to come around.
All that's left now out there are the concrete footings and footpads. But you know, when you've spent several years there, you know every inch of the place, and it's easy to walk around it and easily envision what it was like in its heyday.
And the day came when the honeysuckle was told that we no longer would need you and you're finished. We started to pull all the equipment out, and there was a terrible moment where I had to walk out the door for the last time. 8 of us was left. It was a very sad moment. I had a wonderful time at Honeysuckle. All these years later, I'm still living those moments. We all, the whole team of us, we're all still sticking together like a family.